We've looked at all the external things since this was in an accident, like possibly some kind of a shift on the engine, a mount, a harmonic balancer, any of those kind of things. It all checks out normal. Now, as you know, a misfire can be caused by loss of spark, the coil not delivering spark. Let's see if we have spark. This is a V6 engine, and we've got two banks, or two heads. We've got a misfire on the front, and we've got a misfire in the back. Of course, the front is much easier access, and that is cylinder number 2. So I'm going to do my spark testing on cylinder number 2. Most likely it's the same on cylinder number 5 since it's the same problem, but I just have good access up here. So we want to know, is that coil delivering spark to the spark plug? Let's use a kV tester. Now this engine is a V6 and it has a coil pack. 3 coils, each coil firing 2 cylinders. And it just so happens that the middle coil is firing cylinder number 2 and cylinder number 5, which is where our misfires are. So naturally we're going to suspect it's possibly the coil, the middle coil, is not firing. So let's check that out. So we want to know if that coil is firing, delivering spark. So I've set up my kV tester on cylinder number 2, and you can see I've got it set for 30 kV. And we're getting 30 kV of spark with or without the misfire. Right now the engine is misfiring, you can see it shaking, and our spark is delivering spark. This is the single cylinder secondary pattern during the misfire. So the coil is firing during the misfire. It's not an ideal pattern, but keep in mind the cylinder is misfiring. I just want to confirm that the coil is being commanded on. So we've just proved now that we're not losing spark, because even when our engine is misfiring, our spark is firing at the spark plug. And then when the engine smooths out and idles, we're still getting spark at the spark plug. So it appears that spark delivery is not our problem. And we got a misfire, so the next thing to check is injectors. Now I'm suspecting that injector number 2 has a problem. So I want to look at that signal, but I also want to compare it to an injector that I don't think has a problem. So as we look at our wiring diagram for the fuel injectors, you see injector number 1 has a black and a pink. Number 3 has a pink with black and a pink. Number 5 has a black with white and a pink. So the pink is common. That's our power wire. So we want to look at the black with white, which is the ground side of number 5, and the orange wire, which is the ground side of number 2. Those 2 injectors are what we want to see if they're working. So as we look at the wiring diagram, I want to pick an injector that's on the other side or the other bank of the engine. Well, it just happens to be that cylinder number 1 injector is a black wire, and it happens to be that it's the next cavity up from this one. So we'll back probe that, and we'll look at cylinder number 1 injector and cylinder number 2 injector, one on each bank. Now on this engine, the injectors are buried underneath the intake, so they're very hard to get to. We actually can't get to each one. So the next best thing is to get to a common connector. And you can see that the wires disappear under here, and they go under for the injectors, but they all come out to this common connector right here. So we can tap into the wires right here. Now the way this connector is set up, on the back side back here, the wire colors correspond to our electrical diagram, but then they go through this connector and they come out on this side. On this side, the wire colors are different. So what we need to do is look at our diagram. On the back side, find the wire that we're looking for. Let's say, for example, it's an orange wire, and we count down the left side and it's in cavity number 4. Then you would come around to the front and you'd count down cavity number 4, and that would be the corresponding wire on this side. So that's where we're going to do our back probing, because the access is so much easier. As you can see on the back side of this injector connector, the orange wire was for injector number 2, and if you count down, that's in cavity number 4. So I'm going to go around to the front side and back probe cavity number 4. So I count down here 1, 2, 3, 4, and on this side it's a green with the black, but I'm going to back probe that for my injector number 2. And I take the other end of this back probe and I connect it to the lead that's going to my lap scope. So I'm back probed into number 2 injector. So I'm going to back probe the next injector, number 1, which is the next cavity up, and I'm going to connect that to my green lead on the lap scope. So when we start the car with our injectors back probe, our lap scope comes up to what its automatic settings are, and we can see a square wave pattern or an injector pulse width pattern here for injector number 2, which is the one we think is bad. Now it just disappeared, and we've got the misfire. You can feel the misfire. It just disappeared. But what happened to cylinder number 1? We've got them both back probed. Now as you'll watch, the misfire is going to go away, and we're going to get our injector back here. Now the engine is smoothed out, we have no more misfire, and we've got this injector. But the scope is always going to set up in somewhat of a preset, so I'm going to take number green, which is our injector number 5, or number 1, the good injector, but you can see we can't see it. That's because we're on 10 milliseconds. It's actually there, but we need to go up here to sweep and change our sweep. Let's go to 200 milliseconds. Now of course that is going to squeeze it back down. You don't see it as wide, but we can keep looking at the injector now. You can see we're triggered. We got the trigger on the yellow injector, which is cylinder number 2, and cylinder number 1 is over here. So when our misfire occurs, the yellow injector goes away. Now the green is still here, it's bouncing around because we're not triggered on the green, we're triggered on the yellow. So if I want to make that consistent, I can go up here and I select my trigger, and I want to trigger off number 2, which is the green. And now you can see my trigger is right here, and I'm triggering off the green. Now the yellow is there, that's the misfire. Our engine right now is running smooth. But in a moment here, we'll get our misfire, and you're going to see cylinder number 2 disappear. Now we've got our misfire. So cylinder number 1, cylinder number 1 is still firing. Now if I change my sweep and go back to 10 milliseconds, now you can see it's actually wide again because I changed to 10 milliseconds. But we're triggering off of the green. Now if I want to see when the bad one comes back, I can go and set my trigger to number 1. Now I'm triggering off the yellow again. You can see my trigger right there. The injector is coming on. We can't see the green because I'm back to 10 milliseconds. Now we got a misfire, and the yellow, which is cylinder number 2, disappeared.
Now remember, the injectors fire sequentially, so at 10 milliseconds you can only see one. To see more than that, you must increase the time span, but that will make them appear thinner.
Okay, so we're losing the injector pulse width on cylinder number 2 and 5 fuel injector. Now what could cause that? Cam sensor. So we actually need now to look at the cam sensor signal and see if it's dropping out or something's happening to it. As we look at the electrical diagram, the same one we looked at injectors, we just move over and we can see the cam sensor. The middle wire, which is the signal wire, is red. So that's what we need to back probe to find the cam sensor. Well, it just so happens that the cam sensor wire is through this same harness. On this back side it's red, and when it comes through on this side when you follow the cavity, it changes to a blue. So we've backprobed the blue wire. We're going to go to the blue lead on our lab scope.
The cam sensor is triggered off a reluctor wheel, and it provides 4 pulses every camshaft revolution.
Now if you look at the lab scope again, you can see our yellow trace, which is the misfire, the injector that's dropping out. And you can see the blue trace up there. It's doing something, but we really can't tell what it's doing, so we need to change again our sweep. So I'm going to go up here and change our sweep. And I'm going to change it to 100 milliseconds. And now you can see we've got a pattern in it. We're triggering off of the cylinder number 2 injector, and our cam sensor is staying even. But that's really not telling us because this is dropping out. So you'll see when this cylinder drops out, then everything gets nuts up here. So what we need to do is we're going to change our sweep to 200 milliseconds so we can see it just a little bit better. Then I'm going to change my trigger to cylinder or trace number 3, which is the blue. And you can see now my trigger is right there. So the cam sensor is going to stay triggered. And you can see the green is injector number 1, and it stays. The cam sensor stays, but we've lost injector number 2. I'm going to change my sweep one more time to 500 milliseconds. And now you can see the better pattern on the cam sensor. Now if I freeze this, you can see that our cam sensor has two large on patterns, on, off, off. On, off, off. And that repeats. And we have injector number 1 and injector number 2. Now that's when it's running smooth. I'm going to turn this back live. Now we're live and we've got the misfire, and you see we don't have injector number 2. Now injector number 2, the yellow one, just came back and our engine smoothed out. So our cam sensor is not dropping out. So the next thing I want to look at here is the crank sensor. Now normally the fuel injectors get their sequencing from the camshaft position sensor, but it basically all triggers off the crank sensor, which identifies number 1. It's usually used for misfire, but what if there was a problem there? So I at least want to look at it. Now on our same diagram where we had the cam sensor and our injectors, we can go down to the bottom of the page and we can see we've got our crank position sensor. It's the white with the black wire.
The crank sensor produces a square wave, and it consists basically of 58 teeth.
Now on this engine, the crank sensor is pretty hard to get to as far as access. So I'm actually going to go to the computer. We're going to back probe it to the wiring diagram. We see that it's pin number 45. And we've back probed it. Now we can look at it on our scope. Now, as usually is the case, the lab scope defaulted to the 10 milliseconds, but if I got my crank, but I have my crank sensor now on the red trace, and you can see that we've got a nice square wave there. The blue is still the cam sensor, yellow and green are the injectors, and we're going to have to change our sweep so we can see it better. So I'm going to go back to my sweep, and I'm going to go to 200 milliseconds. Of course, you know that squishes everything down. And now you can see we've got a crank sensor that's steady, we've got a cam sensor that's steady, and both of the injectors, 1 and 2, are firing. Now if you look at our signal, I've got it set on a 1 second sweep now. It's taking 1 second to go across here. My crank signal is at the top, the red, the blue is the cam, the green is injector number 1, and you notice right now the yellow, injector number 2, which is the suspect, is actually dropped out. Now I want to slow this down and take a little closer look. At the cam sensor. Now we've slowed it down to 100 milliseconds. We're still syncing off of the crank sensor. I'm going to trigger off of number 3, which is the cam sensor. We're triggering off the cam and noticing that the crank is not dropping out. So our crank sensor is good, our cam sensor is good, our spark is good. We're just losing injectors 2 and 5 repeatedly, and always those 2. All the rest of them stay together. So what could be the problem? So we've got some more information. We've got some evidence, we've done some testing. Now what do you think the problem is, and what would be your next course of action?